I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to give me their view on that, to share their view on how transformative these changes really are. I mean, how much of an impact is digitalization going to make? How quickly? And can you please provide at least one example of where you've seen this happen in practice? But Simon, you're from China, or you're based in China, where a lot of these changes are happening very quickly. What's your view?
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you again for the invitation. Look, one of the first things that I did when I joined Huawei was I was asked to do a bit of a mapping exercise and to help the company develop or determine what its position is on a lot of these new trade agreements that are trying to develop rules for the digital economy. And so we started out by thinking about, okay, well, so what is the digital economy? And we sort of broke it down into 4 basic elements. So you've got the infrastructure layer, which is where all of this connectivity infrastructure and equipment plays out. And then the next layer is everything that happens on the top. So that's really the services layer. But then we looked at it a little bit more differentiated, and we found that there's also a layer of sort of platforms and ecosystems, which is really the result of multi-device connectivity and people wanting to use the same applications and being able to access the same functionality across different devices, different times, different places. And then the last layer was devices, and that used to just be your laptop. That's how you would connect to the internet, but then increasingly that became just mobile, and now we're moving very quickly towards a world of wearables and virtual reality, augmented reality, the Internet of Things, the Internet of Vehicles, the Internet of Everything. But also the most important trend that we recognized, of course, was this idea of convergence. So, you talk about the economy and you talk about the digital economy, but basically they're just becoming the economy, right? So, in the old days, you don't talk now about the electrical economy and the non-electrical economy, after the invention of electricity. I mean, electricity is just something that you need in order to have the economy. And the convergence of these 2 technologies, which is digitization and then connectivity, has produced this thing called the digital economy, which is going into all economic sectors. So you asked for some examples. So I mean, there are very many. We've touched on some of them today. I think about, the most obvious example is, of course, communications, right? So if you think back, I'm still old enough to remember when it took us 6 months to get a landline installed, and actually making what was called the trunk call in those days, because I grew up in Australia and England, and calling back to England from Australia was actually a very expensive prospect, and it's something you'd only do sort of once a year for somebody's birthday. And then I also remember actually the very first phone bills that I got when I got my first mobile phone. So I got my first mobile phone in 1998. It was actually a Samsung, and I remember my first phone bills. I was living in Switzerland at the time. My mobile phone bills were very, very high. Today, communication is something you do instantaneously, and you communicate also via instant messaging, something we didn't have, 20, 30 years ago. And these days, if you don't live in the UAE, you use voice over internet protocol, and most of your calls, whether they're voice or video, are going to be free. So communications is obviously a sector that's been hugely impacted by this. Others would be finance, banking, and payments, and now I can give some examples from China. So, I don't know if you think about, when was the last time you were actually inside a bank? So I only go to the bank 3 times. I go there when I open an account, when I lose my card in an ATM because it gets swallowed somewhere, or when I want to close an account. And for the rest of the time, I just do everything on the internet and on mobile. So retail banking has been transformed, and payments has also been transformed. But this only in a number of mobile payments has been transformed, but only in a number of countries. And so the great thing about living in China, there are a lot of great things about living in China, but the really great thing is just the convenience of how quickly and thoroughly and ubiquitously all of these digital technologies been adopted, and nowhere is that more on display than in online payments. So in China, my wallet is something that sits in my bag, and I don't really take it out of my bag until it's time to go to Hong Kong. Because in Hong Kong, it's still cards and money. But in China, in Shenzhen, everything is just mobile payments. And then I think the last is retail. So this was touched upon by another speaker, but the retail experience has also been transformed by the two technologies of digitization and connectivity. So most of the stuff that we buy now, we actually end up buying online. So I'll stop there. I think a couple of the speakers had some interesting points. You said we have nothing to fear. I think we need to talk about that a little bit. Sure. But otherwise, I think there are some interesting things. I think there are some interesting things to talk about in terms of the impact on jobs.
Okay. And Simon, you're based in a country which has really grasped this change and is at the forefront of it. China, which is is at the cusp of industrial automation, at the cusp of robotics. Your firm, at the cusp of telecommunications with 5G. Threat or opportunity, how do you see it?
Look, I think I'm all for optimism, but I think you also need to realize that, my background is in trade, and one of the things that we talk about is the difficulty of trade adjustment, right? So the real problem is that, yes, the world is going to be better. There are going to be winners and losers, but, what do you do about the losers? Are they on their own? Is it their own problem? The reason why we have this crisis of Western democracy in the US and the EU in particular, and why we're seeing increasingly authoritarian governments or populist governments being elected, is because you've got large segments of the electorate who no longer believe that the future for their children is going to be better. Their children are going to have a better life than they did. That's actually no longer true if you look at the US, even in Australia. That's no longer true, and so a lot of people are quite anxious about the future, right? So the great thing about the future is that, yes, it favors those with skills, and that jobs are going to become better paid, less dangerous. But again, if you live in an economy where you've got access to those skills and you've got a certain equality of opportunities, not about equality of outcomes, but equality of opportunities, then yes, then you can be optimistic about the future. But that's not the reality for many countries, especially developing countries, least developed countries, where large segments of the population don't have access to the education that they need. I think that's something that policymakers need to think a little bit more about. There are very few countries in the world, maybe Finland is one of them, that are really educating their people in order to be able to adapt to this new model of lifelong learning and transform themselves and transform their careers, 3 or 4 times in the space of their lives.
Simon.
Look, I just wanted to say, the question is, how do investment location decisions get made? For Huawei, we're a sales-driven organization, right? So we're often doing market-seeking FDI, but it sort of depends what kind of investment decisions we're making. So if we're looking to set up a research and development center, then those decisions obviously follow skills and ecosystems. So our first research facility in the US was opened in Plano, Texas, and that's because many decades ago, Bell Labs and then Lucent were set up there, and it produced all these great engineers. And then our second site in the US was Santa Clara, proximity to Silicon Valley. And then there are many examples of that. But I think as regulators and as governments need to think about this, there are certain factors that attract that they can't change, which is market size. You're either a big or a small market. Economic geography is something governments don't have a lot of influence over. Demographics, again, very hard to change in the short term. But there are other things that governments can exercise a lot of influence over, and one is, of course, the regulatory environment. The other two are infrastructure and having a sort of leadership and a vision on where you as a country want to go and where along the value chain you want to add value. The other cross-cutting issues would be skills and then the ease of doing business. You know, if you're looking for a silver bullet on what is the real sort of area where a policy intervention can make a big difference, I think it's skills. But skills is not everything. You've got to have a regulatory environment. If you look at Lebanon produces these very, very skilled people. They're the best linguists in the region. They all speak 3 or 4 languages, and they're just smart and well educated. But they all leave Lebanon because there's no jobs there. And you know, there's problems with political stability, but there's also just no business environment there, except for, you know, a very small clique. So the Lebanese export all their labor. Malaysia does the same thing to a smaller level. So Malaysia also produces some very smart people, and a lot of them end up leaving first to study overseas, and then they stay overseas. So its skills is important, but also having a regulatory environment that's conducive to business.
Great. We have time for one more quick question,
Let me just
but a
say
really
something
quick
about
one.
cybersecurity. Can I just add something about
Simon,
cybersecurity?
go
I have to say something because
Sure.
I work for Huawei, obviously, and we've been tackling this issue head on the last few months. Look, I think it's a multi-stakeholder approach, right? So we've all got to take a certain amount of responsibility, which means governments, which means individuals on how they protect their own data. And also companies. And so what Huawei started doing back as early as 2010 when this came up as an issue in the UK was to subject all of our product solutions and coding to third-party verification and to open it up to allow experts to check the integrity of any new products that we'll put on the market. Now, of course, that's raised our costs, but we've seen that's actually made our systems some of the most secure on Earth, and we're now actually calling for that to become an industry standard. So we've now adopted that model. We started in the UK. We've now adopted that model in Germany. We've just opened a new centre in Bonn. Does the same thing. Canada, we've had that going for a few years now, and now we're proposing to other governments that if they have any doubts, then they should come to a new cybersecurity centre we've opened in Brussels.
Okay, excellent.
Right? So it's third-party verification, certification. Yeah.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking the panelists for their time. Thank you very much.